Hello and welcome to this edition of TZM Global Radio. I'm your host for today, James Phillips from the UK chapter of the Zeitgeist Movement and TZM Education. Hope you're doing well out there, guys and gals. So, the introduction to today's show was the first track from Enter Shikari's new album, A Flash Flood of Colour. Reason I'm including that is because I went to watch them a week and a half ago at Hatfield Uni over here in the UK. So please do forgive me for disappearing completely up their arseholes here, but they were absolutely amazing. Their show featured their usual antics of human pyramids, mosh pits, crowd surfing, stage diving, wonderfulness, and basically was a really, really good night, to say the least. And a very interesting addition, if any of you heard my interview with Rao on TZM Global Radio, the singer that is, the guitarists both had torches out of the end of their headstocks on their guitars. If you remember, Rao told a story about him being knocked out with one, so when I went back there, I was like, so I see health and safety has made it into your performance. But, you know, it looks cool as well, so I'll forgive you for that. No, it was a great show, and if you can imagine what the mosh pit was like when that track kicks in, it was something to behold, I will say. The other reason I'm including it is to make a sort of opening statement. We were obviously there as part of the Zeitgeist Movement to hand out our materials, and these materials I've generally picked up from different people and what have you over the years, and I did have quite a substantial amount of flyers to hand out. I've done several street activism events, obviously, and several schools, but doing this particular gig and handing them out, got rid of all of them. Every single last one. And when we went in the venue or outside the venue to see how many had been dropped on the floor, basically none. So, okay, hands up out there in the Zeitgeist Movement who's into the notion of efficiency. Okay, do you feel like a bit of an idiot now sitting alone by yourself with your hand raised in the air? Point being that we're all into efficiency here, right? Yeah, guys? Okay, well, I spoke to Rao, and he said that he hasn't had a terrible amount of Zeitgeist Movement members like getting in touch with him to go to their shows to hand out flyers. Shame on you, efficiency monkeys. What are you doing? Get in touch with this guy, man. Seriously. This crowd were shouting the words, fuck all borders, fuck all boundaries, fuck all flags, and fuck nationalities. You've got to give us a chance before we reach our system meltdown. You want to go for the low-hanging fruit? Does that also resound reasonably well with you? Then you need to go to one of these shows. It's quite important. I mean, Rao said from the stage, like near the end, before they played like their last track, he said, big shout out to the Zeitgeist Movement for being here. Basically, that changed the way we view the world. And needless to say, they took a greater interest in our flyers on the way out than they did necessarily on the way in. And there were so many of them walking past us saying, oh yeah, the Zeitgeist Movement, I've checked you guys out online, it's wicked, man. We're standing there at the door basically saying to these guys, want to know what the third album's about? Read that. Want to know what the third album's about? Read that. And then, you know, some people with the T-shirt on for the third album would walk past us, and I'd say, oh, so you don't want to know what they're singing about on that T-shirt that you're wearing? You know, you've got the T-shirt, and you don't want to know what the album's about. And then they'd turn around and go, oh my God, I feel like a dick, give me one of those flyers. So it was a really, really great night, and we gave the band one of our Activism banners and stuff with like Carl Sagan quotes on it and what have you, for them to take out on the road and set up at their merch stand. And me and Christian, who went with me to the gig, were just looking at each other like, we have to do this a lot more. This is obviously an incredibly sensible route for our activism. Not that it's the only one, of course. I know that the street activism stuff should stay varied. It's nice for people to see us in different locations and see that, you know, we have a presence. I can appreciate that point as well. But if you want to just grab the low-hanging fruit and get a lot of flyers into the hands of people who are going to give a shit, then stuff like this is important, guys. You know, it really is. So I would definitely encourage you to get online, have a look at Enter Shikari's website and see where they're playing next. Chances are they're going to be coming to a town near you very soon, because they play 250 odd shows a year right around the world, so it shouldn't be too long before they get round to you. If you want to get in touch with Rao directly, the singer that is, his email's rao@entershikari.com. Do be patient with him, he's a very busy chap, but hopefully he should get back to you in enough time if you put in the subject line Zeitgeist Movement at your show or this show or something along those lines, and then he'll know what it's about. Thanks, guys. In other news, movement related, I recently took the Science and Sustainability exhibition to a primary school, my daughter's primary school, which again was probably the most successful visit to any school I've ever done. I've previously sort of shunned the idea of going to primary schools in favour of giving a presentation, a full presentation that is, to sixth formers, which are around the sort of 17, 18-year-old sort of age range, because I feel, I can give a presentation and give over the train of thought to a young generation, so that's the way I should be going. But upon doing this event to 7 to 11-year-olds, I have to say, I think there's probably more merit in it, if you've got the tools to do the job, that is. Let me explain. Basically, obviously the exhibition showcases what technology we have available to us, what we could do if we join the dots between them, and what we're actually capable of. So I did 3 separate presentations of the exhibition for years 4, 5 and 6 at the school, and before they went in, I went into their classrooms and said, okay kids, what's the best way to farm food, like cleanly and abundantly, like so we can produce a lot of it and it's fresh? And they went, well, tractors. And I said, okay, cool, tractors on fields, fine. What about water? What about water? What's the best way of doing that? And they went through that. What about long-distance travel? And they also obviously said, planes. So that they gave the standard answers. And I said, okay, that's cool. When you come through to this exhibition, that's all about to change. And, of course, they're like, whoa. So, and then they went in, and I basically just went round the exhibition, quick fire, showing them what the technological application is, how it can solve problems, obviously in scaled down language, just to really get the message across. And then I showed them the Venus Project bit second and said, look, this is what I think is the solution. But before I did that, I laid out 2 very important points. The first was, before I even went round the exhibition, in fact, was don't believe a word I say. I love the response from older kids to this sort of question, but my God, younger kids, it freaks the shit out of them, I have to say. They sort of sat there in bewildered disbelief at like this guy, like, hang on, our parents and our teachers are constantly telling us to just not question and do what we're told, and you come in and say, please question, and if it doesn't make sense to you, don't do it. And the bewildered look on their face, bless them. But they smiled afterwards, because I basically said, look, I could be lying to you. This could all just sound really, really nice, what you're about to hear here. So don't take my word for it. If it doesn't stand up to evidence, just drop it. Yeah? Very, very important, because that is the backbone of science, kids. Science is all about dropping your previous belief in the face of new evidence. And if we didn't do that, we wouldn't know what shape the planet we all live on actually is. Okay? And the second point, once I've got around the first part of the exhibition, was why is it when we've got all of this technology that exists that this is not happening? Now, this is not my question to answer. It's your question, because it's your future. You are the adults of tomorrow. So the question I want you to take forward with you in life when you've seen all of what's available is, why is this not happening? If you want, go home and ask your parents it. Now, I think I've got my ideas for why it isn't happening, and I'd like to show you what I would like to do if we could join these dots together. And then I explain the Venus Project stands to them. And the fascinating thing about this was the first 7 questions out of the block, I think it was about 7, 4 of them I could not answer. I had to say I don't know. Because the best thing happens with kids, and it was that particular presentation was for the youngest class. In adult Q&As, I can't remember the last time I had to say I don't know. because their brains just don't work the same way kids do. I wish I could remember the questions they asked, but basically they were questions surrounding the technological capability. They were like, well, couldn't cars double up as planes? And I was like, I don't know. I'm not an expert. I don't think anybody's done it yet, but I don't think we can do it. I don't know. So, you're going to have to go and find out whether that's worth doing, whether it can be done. They ask questions like that. They don't ask questions that are so indoctrinated into the culture we exist. They just want to know whether something's doable. It's all they give a shit about. And it's just such a relief to have people just asking technical questions. And yeah, many of them I won't have the answer to, because I don't work in hydroponics and I don't work in Google Car and I don't work in these things. I take an interest in them and I try to decipher what's true from the evidence presented and then go with it. But the fact that I had to say I don't know so many times was brilliant, and just goes to show you the openness of those young minds towards being able to create whatever reality they want. And essentially, I think that's why kids are adults' best teachers in that particular department, because they just call them out on their bullshit, because they've got fresh eyes to all of this, fresh ears to all of this, and they're not prepared to just put up with the obstacles that you have put in the way because of your cultural conditioning. And I think they're really there to teach us a lesson, teach us something we've forgotten about being children. And still in further positive news, we did a joint event with the London Futurists and had David Wood kindly come and give a talk for us about the exponential trends in technology, on top of the Z-Day lecture he did for us in London. So that was really excellent, and I gave a talk alongside David entitled The Socio-Techno Toolkit for a Sustainable Future. The basic angle of this particular talk was saying, okay, so we've got this exponential trend in technology, we've got all this technology just around the corner. What kind of society do we want to build with it, and what kind of approach should we take? And it's advocating the sort of technical approach as a problem-solving method, basically. So that's the angle of that particular presentation, which is being edited together as we speak and should hopefully be up online in the next few weeks. And that's in fact what I'm intending to do with the different organisations that we're giving these presentations with at the Elixir Bar, is to write a different presentation each month to come at the train of thought from the angle of the organisation we're doing the event with, to sort of plug in different routes into the train of thought of the resource-based economy. Because, I wasn't busy enough. In other news, the 5th episode of Culture in Decline is out, Baby Go Boom, which was a really interesting title. When it came on, I wondered what it was going to be about, but essentially it's about sticking dynamite up babies' arses. Another hilarious image from Peter Joseph there. Thank you very much, Peter. Of course, this wasn't the only theme to the episode. It was more along the lines of true security and safety in a given society, and focused particularly heavily on the American prison system. It was quite funny, actually. It came after just a day of me watching a really, really good excerpt from QI, a show over here in the UK featuring Stephen Fry and various other people who sort of go over certain topics in a really funny and interesting way. And so I wanted to play that excerpt because I think it really just showcases and brings out the fact that we as the movement are not the only people who spot the major issues with these different things going on around the world. We're just slightly different in that we won't enter into the debate on the limited frame of reference that our culture dictates. We will actually step away from that and say, what are the causal mechanisms behind this? And is our culture structured in a way to limit the propensity for this type of behavior, for this type of violence? Where does our true security lie? And that's the difference. But I think this next particular segment is very interesting, so I do want to include it at this point. So this is QI, laying out the problems with the prison system, and in this case in particular, the US.
Where are 1% of American adults? What's the population?
300 million, isn't it?
So you're talking about between 2.5 and 3 million, say.
Jail.
Yes. G for jail. English spelling of jail, of course, but it is G for jail.
Really? That many people? 3 million people are locked up?
Well, 2.3, which is 1 in every 99.1 adults. It's more than 3 times as many as the Iranians, more than 6 times as many as the Chinese. No society in history has imprisoned more of its citizens than the United States of America.
We do pretty well, though, don't we? We sort of top the European League.
We're ahead of China, Turkey, and India.
Yes.
Yeah, with 148 prisoners per 100,000.
It's the 3 strikes and they're out.
That's been really the problem, yeah.
I mean, a legal system based on baseball just seems bizarre.
Yeah.
We do seem to understand the law. It's all very complicated. What's simple? What do people like? Baseball. Right then. Here's the rules.
3 strikes and you're out, yeah.
Mental.
What it means is if the first 2 strikes, the first 2 crimes you're convicted of are serious enough, the third one, no matter how trivial, will get a life sentence, 25 years or more. So, for example, Leandro Andrade is serving 2 consecutive 25-year terms for shoplifting 9 videotapes.
He took 9?
Yes. Kevin Webber, 26 years for stealing 4 chocolate chip cookies. It's astonishing.
It's really stupid, isn't it? Because if you know you're on this sort of deal...
Yeah.
Pay fine. Yes. That is the idea. Do another murder. Do a bank job. There's no point.
There's no point doing anything trivial.
No, I know. Get caught.
It is a bit bonkers. But the racial numbers are a bit worrying. And the gender numbers, it's 1 in 30 men aged 20 to 34 is behind bars. But for black males, that's 1 in 9. 1 in 9. There are more 17-year-old black people in jail than in college in America. So 5% of the world are American, 25% of all prisoners
Isn't the real
are American.
controversy with this the business end of it?
Well, that's true. It's also, as you say, right, it is a business.
And it's not just license plate, they make loads of stuff.
Well, one of the things I should have said when talking about contraband is that you're not allowed to bring into America anything that's been made by forced labor or prisons. But in America, you could almost say, if you were so minded, that they've reinvented the slave trade. They produce, for example, 100% of all military helmets, ammunition belts, bulletproof vests, ID tags and other items uniform, 93% of domestically produced paints, 36% of home appliances, 21% of office furniture, which allows the United States to compete with factories in Mexico because, of course, obviously the workers can't refuse to work for 25 cents an hour.
I very much like to say something hilarious, but something must be done.
It is.
It's a bit more question timey to say.
It is a bit amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
More than 1 in 100 American adults are in jail.
So, there you have it, folks. That's that freedom that the American politicians keep going on about. Freedom, more like. Anyway, in other recent news, I did an interview for the largest Star Trek online podcast in the world, something called TrekMate. If you want to check that out online, feel free to do so. But that was a really great interview. It was nice to get that invite because if you've ever seen any of the Star Trek episodes before, many of them have a real social premise to them that's very, very similar to the resource-based economic model. And actually, Jacques Fresco once helped with the designs for some of the Star Trek episodes. Doug Drexler was the person that he helped out on Star Trek, I believe. And no doubt some of what Jacques talks about must have rubbed off on them, as you can hear from this excerpt from Star Trek: The Next Generation.
I know this is all very confusing to you, so I'll attempt to explain. You are on the starship USS Enterprise.
American.
No, it's a vessel in the United Federation of Planets, and Earth is a member.
A lot has changed in the past 300 years. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We have eliminated hunger, want, the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy. Here's what I propose. You can't stay on the Enterprise, but I have arranged for us to rendezvous with the USS Charleston bound for Earth. They will deliver you there.
Then what will happen to us? There's no trace of my money. My office is gone. What will I do? How will I live?
This is the 24th century. Material needs no longer exist.
That's the challenge.
The challenge, Mr. Offenhouse, is to improve yourself, to enrich yourself.
I concur. I just hope that it doesn't take another 300-odd years. I fear that we don't have that long, folks. There was a really interesting story I heard from somewhere that this particular captain on Star Trek, Jean-Luc Picard, played by Patrick Stewart, was interviewed when he became the new captain, and he's bald. And so one of the questions to him was, so in your futuristic society, you telling me that you haven't been able to solve baldness? At which there was a nice ripple of laughter that went round the room. But when the ripples had died down, he said something absolutely brilliant. He said, oh yes, we very much know how to solve that problem. But you see, in our world, it doesn't matter. Perfect. Or not, as the case may be. Don't want any of our detractors out there thinking that I'm advocating for a perfect world. We would hate to be called utopian now, wouldn't we? Anyway, if we do want to see a world such as the one just outlined in that clip from Star Trek, then it would seem rather evident that technology is going to play a central role. So, later on in the show, I will be reading from the First Civilization, but carrying on this theme of technology and the advancement of it, I would like to include David Wood's lecture from London Z-Day 2013 for the London Futurists. Here you go, guys. Enjoy.
Many thanks, James, and I'm really glad to be one of the dots here today. I think it's a great idea bringing these complementary perspectives together. My perspective is going to be less about economics. I thought that was absolutely fascinating what we just heard. It'll be more about technology, because that's what I've been immersed in. Before I go any further, I will say that the slides I'm using today are available on SlideShare. So if there are people watching online, I think there is live streaming of this, you can get my slides from the Delta Wisdom, that's all one word, Delta Wisdom part of SlideShare. So I'm going to be bringing a technology perspective, a humanity plus and singularitarian perspective, and I'll explain the significance of these terms. What I've got on this opening slide is actually the logo of London Futurists, when you can see there's a person here with his or her brain on fire, so it seems, in part because seriously discussing near futures is a very interesting, very thought-provoking subject, and I encourage all of you to get involved in these discussions, but also in part, I believe that if we're going to survive through the coming crises, and we are living already in a crisis and it may get worse, we're going to need all to be smarter, individually and collectively smarter. So that's the other meaning of this logo. I'm going to cover in the next 20 minutes or so 5 themes. Very interested in sustainable social structures, absolutely share the goals of the Zeitgeist Movement there. But we have to be aware that there are some even bigger changes coming which we need to pay account of. If we're not aware of the largest changes just around the corner, we are at some risk of solving yesterday's problems. The biggest change is technology. We're already seeing how technology is bringing lots of change. I believe that technology's impact is actually going to grow more in the next 5 years than in the last 10 years. And there are both good and bad aspects of that. We heard in the opening talk how technology could be used in many ways to implement a resource-based economy, but there are also many drawbacks of technology accelerating away. Can we predict the future? I don't think so. There are too many unknowns. We don't know how fast the technology is going to be developed. We don't know how technology is going to interact with each other. We don't quite know how the applications will come. So the future is opaque, but still we must try. And I will be giving some tips as to how to predict the future with some more hope of getting it right. And at the end of my talk, I'll give 10 predictions for what I think technology is going to do in the next 5 to 10 years. Not only do I think the future is opaque, I think it's open in the sense that we can actually make a big difference to it. And indeed, we must make a big difference. And if we all sit back and just wait for a better future to come, the likelihood is it won't be coming. And along the way, I'll be introducing a few concepts. But let's talk about predicting the future. So there's an American gentleman who I know who recently went to visit a futurist and said, please tell me what's in my future. And the futurist spent a while gazing at her crystal ball. And her mind got a bit puzzled. And she said, I'm sorry, I can't make much predictions because I can't read Chinese. So what I'm saying to you here is that actually you'll be able to understand the future better if you get the right language. And the language isn't actually Chinese, although it might help because China is certainly significant. But there are other terms which I want to introduce you to. And one of them is accelerating change, and how accelerating change is driven by positive feedback cycles. I'm going to talk about how these positive feedback cycles can be set up. I'm going to talk about convergence, which is when more than one technology stream comes together, and we're beginning to see that in larger and larger ways. I'm going to talk about the singularity, which, if you like, is the granddaddy of all convergences. It's when many convergences converge together, and where things are really hard to predict. And I'm going to talk about the Humanity Plus philosophy, which is a way of making sense of all of the above. And Humanity Plus is quite a different heritage from Zeitgeist Movement, but I'm pleased to say I do find a lot in common, and you'll be able to see some of that as we go on. Now, you might have wondered where this picture came from. It came from Newsweek just over a couple of years ago. So what's happened to Newsweek? Have any of you been into a newsagent recently and bought yourself a Newsweek? Well, you can't buy it anymore. It had its last print edition just before Christmas. They've given up on trying to sell versions. Why have they given up? It is available online now, yes. And indeed, many newspapers are being transformed by online. If we look at, if we just go back a couple of years, let's look at what newspapers thrive on. They thrive on advertising revenue. And if you were an executive in a newspaper company, or if you were advising them, say about 2003, and you looked at this cyclical, up and down nature of a newspaper advertising revenue, what would you have predicted for the future? Seeing a little bit of online, you might just see there on the slide, the red line, a little bit of online advertising to complement the advertising from the print edition. So what happened next? A little bit up, a little bit down?
Exponential.
Went through the floor, right? So that is why many people in the newspaper industry are losing their jobs. Still, of course, Newsweek exists, but it is very different from before. There are many other examples of this convergence. In abstracting away, what we're seeing is the tech trends of one industry, or the tech trends of one movement, get impacted and transformed, sometimes very detrimentally, by the tech trends of another industry, such as the internet industry, or the smartphone industry, or others that I'll talk about. And in this case, it's really bad news for that initial industry. It's a shadow of its former self. Some examples. HMV. And if you've ever been to HMV buying a vinyl or buying CDs there? Just a few years ago, I was at the Kingston HMV. You could hardly move. There was so many people there. And what's happened to it now? 4,000 jobs have all gone. Don't know if any of you in the audience ever worked at HMV. It's another example, Blockbuster. Spent many years of my life in Blockbuster too, trying to figure out which DVD to take home, or VHS tape, or whatever it was. What's happened to that too? Again, a collapse, because it's been radically impacted by new technology, again by online in this case. So once again, convergence is, and the worst kind of convergence is when one movement or one technology gets steamrolled out of existence, in some cases by the trends from another industry. That's negative convergence. Now, what I try and do as a professional is I try and advise companies actually how to turn these incoming changes more to their advantage. And so you end up with recreated. You end up with some of your business or your movement intact, and you've gone to creating new jobs, creating new revenues, creating really useful things. But how do we make this transformation from one case when something is steamrolled out of existence by technology and into this more enhanced and transformed nature? And you need to do two things. You need to see it coming. You need to open your eyes. You need to be aware of the trends. But then secondly, you need a lot of skills, because even if you see a steamroller coming flat at you, doesn't mean you can jump on it and steer it in the right direction. You need to be very nimble. You need to have lots of skills to do that. So I'm not going to talk so much about that today, but I am going to talk about seeing some of the steamrollers coming in our direction. The industry I know best, because I've lived there for 25 years, is the smartphone industry. Let me just talk about the changes in 10 years from the 2000 to 2010. At the beginning of that period, nobody even knew about smartphones. There was just a few people talking about them. They might be the reserve of the technology geek, or they might be the reserve of a very small number of business people. Whereas at the end of the decade, as the devices have become more and more powerful, with more data, with lots more bandwidth, with many more apps, they're used by more and more people. And indeed, the predictions are for 2013 that there will be 1 billion of these devices sold in just that 1 year. So, and we can look ahead even to more and more people in the world using them. So it's partly because of the functionality they deliver. They deliver things which I believe are, in many cases, useful, whether it's maps, whether it is access to Wikipedia on the go, whether it's access to Google on the go, the games, the augmented reality, and so on. But many companies have gone out of existence because of this transformation. There are winners as well as losers. That's the past. I'm more interested in what's going to happen next. And if that's been what's happened in the smartphone industry in the last 10 years, in the next 5 years, the trend to look out for is that many of the same bits of technology that have gone into making these phones so low cost and widely spread, many of these same bits of technology will end up in many different types of devices. So we talk about smartphone technology everywhere, with embedded software and the embedded sensors and the screens and the multimedia ending up in all kinds of different devices. I don't have time to go into this much, but here's one of the more radical aspects. You don't see people going around like this yet, but in the course of the next 5 years, you're going to see lots and lots of people wearing headgear of one sort or another. You may think, oh, that's weird, but bear in mind the first time you saw people walking down the street holding a phone in their hands, it was weird. Or when they were walking down the street without apparently holding anything and talking, that was weird, when they had a headset. In some cases, they were talking into a headset at least. Other cases, talking to the fairies, perhaps. But you're going to see more and more people like this. If you work at Google, you're apparently very good looking. That's coming next. That's the next technology trend. There are other such trends as well. This is from a UK company, Iconos Consulting, who provide similar things to help people in industrial settings, whether it's in difficult industrial situations. But more generally, there are huge numbers of areas of life that can be impacted, not by phones, but by the same technology ending up in lots of places, whether it's wearable computers, whether it's in your spectacles, in your glasses as part of your clothing, whether it's tablets or slates. And I guess many of you in the audience probably have got an iPad, but if you go back 3.5 years, how many of you had iPads then? Nobody. There was no such thing as an iPad just 3.5 years ago, and although people had tried to introduce tablet computers, they'd failed. But in the course of just less than 3 years, 100 million of them were sold. So that's the acceleration that we're seeing already. We'll see more of these devices in various consumer devices, whether it's toys, e-readers. We're seeing them transforming the home increasingly in terms of devices that are more efficient, in terms of how they do the heating and lighting and security. We're seeing them looking after usage of energy in more responsible ways. We're seeing them in cars. We're seeing them in signage. We're seeing this technology in all kinds of robots, including very small robots, and including robots which can help us very smart ways in medical cases. And probably lots of others that I haven't even thought of, and you might be able to advise me and talk about as well. I do think if I did this slide again in 3 years, some of the most important things are things that even now we haven't fully grasped. So that's the big picture. If I give just one example, let's look at the impact of e-books and e-reading. This is from Amazon, their most recent, or one of their recent press conferences in September last year. The line in yellow there is the slow and steady increase in the number of physical books they sold over a course of, 16 years, and how that has already been dwarfed in just 3 years by the number of sales of e-books. This isn't free e-books. This is actual e-books that the people spend money for. So again, it's transforming industries and transforming so many other areas of life. So what's at the heart of this? Why do I have confidence that it's going to continue and actually get even stronger? Well, here's a personal story, and I'm sure you've got similar stories yourself. The first time I got a PC, way back in 1989 when I started work, was given a PC, a Dell, to work with, and I didn't know much in these days, but I found out there was a hard disk and it had 20 megabytes of storage, which seemed enough to store my small little bits of the C program at the time. Some of my colleagues, I figured out, I heard they had 40 megabytes. I thought, what do you do with 40 megabytes? My goodness. And then I got given one, and some of them at 75 megabytes, and then we went up to hundreds of megabytes of hard disks, and then gigabytes of hard disk. And the last time I bought myself a new external hard disk, actually 4 years ago now, it was 2 terabytes in size for roughly the same cost. So how many times larger is 2 terabytes than 20 megabytes? 100,000 times over 20 years. And it roughly works out to the hard disk doubling in size roughly every 14 or 15 months over that period. Now, this has got a name, this trend. It's known as Moore's Law, named after Gordon Moore, who in 1965, even before he co-founded Intel, he was still working at Fairchild Semiconductor. He looked at various chips that he and his colleagues had been making since 1959 onwards. And although it's a straight line in this hand-drawn graph, this is before they used computers to draw this kind of graph, although there are a few points in a straight line, it's actually a log scale. And he noticed actually the number of the chips, the number of transistors we can put on a chip is doubling fairly regularly. And he stuck his neck out a long way. He said, it might be that in 10 years' time, this law will still be holding. Well, that would take us up to 75. It's continued to hold and continued to hold. Last time I talked to one of the people in the CTO office at Intel, which is a few months ago, he said it's quite obvious from what's already in the public domain, there's at least another 12 years of life left in Moore's Law from today. And you can look at it in all kinds of different ways. I mean, I quite like this chart from the Technology Review, looking at how many computations can you get out by putting a kilowatt hour of energy in. And over that long period of time, from 1940 up to just a few years ago, there is this vast increase from the earliest computers, the ENIAC, EDVAC, and so forth, through the first desktop PCs and so forth. We see a change from 1,000 computations per kilowatt hour to a quadrillion computations, which is 40 doublings at a fairly steady rate over these 60 years, again with an 18-month average in doubling. So what will that take us in the next 5 years? How many times can you double the performance in 5 years? Well, you can fit in 18 months a bit more than 3 times. So you double, double, and double a bit more, which comes out to about 10-fold improvement in 10 years. What about, 10-fold improvement in 5 years? How much improvement in computing power are you going to get in 10 years? 100, yes, because you multiply. So over the course of 10 years, what do you do with that improvement power? Well, you can make things go faster. If you don't change anything else, you can make computers run 100 times faster, or you can make them 100 times cheaper. So the iPhone 5, if it's still on sale in 10 years' time, will be 100 times the cost of it is now. And that's simplifying it a bit, but roughly. Or you can make things smaller, and making them smaller has all kinds of advantage, including the smaller they are, the less battery power it needs to drive it. So that's what's going to happen. And there are many other examples in the technology of this kind of trend. We talked about Moore's Law. We can briefly mention Cooper's Law, which is named after Marty Cooper, who was one of the people behind the invention of the mobile phone when he was working in Motorola in the 1980s. He pointed out, because he was a wireless engineer, he pointed out, there's this thing called 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, in which the amount of network is improving all the time. Well, he actually traced this all the way back to 1895. When Marconi was doing some experiments here in the south of England, how much transmission he could get out of his bit before 1G, I don't know, minus 10G or whatever it was in these days, and you get roughly double the amount in every 30 months. So these improvements are going. Now, what's lying behind these improvements? Partly it's laws of physics. Physics makes it possible to do these things, but even more important is the existence of positive feedback cycles. And if we're predicting what's going to happen in the future, we need to be aware of whether these positive feedback cycles are likely to continue or not. So I'll give you some examples. Where do computers come from? Well, they get designed and they get manufactured. And initially they were designed on paper and pencil, and they were manufactured by hand by people with old-fashioned tools. But guess what? Once you've got one set of computers, you can do a little bit of computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacture, and you get a better computer than you could design by yourself. And so on it goes. You go round and round this loop. Better computers allow the design of yet better computers. It's the same with software. How do you create software? Well, there's a lot of human ingenuity goes in there, but software engineers use a lot of software tools, whether it's debuggers, compilers, profilers, optimizers, and so forth. And the better the software gets, the better these tools get, which means, don't laugh, software is actually getting a lot better. despite a lot of the bugs that we still see from time to time. So these positive feedback cycles are still working, and I have no hesitation in predicting we're going to get better computers and better software for the foreseeable future. More generally, what about technology? Where does technology come from? In part, it comes from people who are educated. And guess what? You can use technology to improve education. The invention of the book was a big help for education. The invention of the calculator transformed my childhood. Once upon a time, a lot of my chemistry lessons in the 1970s were lots of doing boring multiplication by logarithms, which most of you are too young to have ever heard of logarithms. But then when the calculators came, the technology meant that we could do more of the chemistry period learning about chemistry rather than wasting it doing long multiplication. More recently, we've had a big step forward because more and more of the best lectures are now available online, and there are very interesting educational tools in technology, which means more and more people throughout the world are benefiting, not just the people in the so-called advanced world, but people throughout India, China, Latin America, Africa. More and more people are benefiting from these online lectures. And not only are there more people involved, they're increasingly well networked together. So somebody in one of these parts of the world who comes up with an interesting idea can put it online, and within 30 minutes, somebody at the other side of the world can complement and get involved in the conversation. So that is why I have no hesitation in saying technology is going to continue to improve roughly at this exponential rate for the foreseeable future. Now, it's not always the case that you can draw these diagrams and expect them to continue. In my professional work, I work with technology companies, pointing out cases in which sometimes this feedback cycle breaks and some platforms fail and go slower. More generally, if we look at the broad environment, technology should be driven by support by citizens who use it, by entrepreneurs who create it, and by the political environment which enables that to take place. And this positive feedback cycle is only half working and half broken, as many of you will know. And if we can fix that better, and the whole point of this discussion is to try and figure out how do we get better politics involved or better governance, then we can actually ensure the technology that is developed is for the general good rather than just for the good of a small number of companies. Now, I talked about improvements in one line of technology. Even more interesting is when you get convergence, when you get things coming from multiple different directions and improving the one product. So, YouTube, I guess most of you have used YouTube. It's a miracle of the modern world. There are more than 1 trillion views in 2011. What made YouTube possible is a whole host of technologies that matured. Not just that there were more internet users. The fact was that more and more people had fast internet access, whether it was broadband or Wi-Fi or 3 and 4G. Also that there were more and more cameras available, whether it's cheap cameras that you get in smartphones. Also that the storage was more affordable, so that companies such as Google could more easily afford to store all these exabytes worth of data. It's the same with an example I already mentioned, the e-reader. What has made the e-reader take off so explosively is a whole combination of different technologies which came together, including the cheap storage, including the high-speed WhisperNet wireless distribution, and there were business model changes too, which I could talk about, but let's keep going. I'm going to give 2 more examples of convergence and combination, even more important than any I've talked about so far. So the second most important example of convergence is in the medical world, in terms of so many technologies are coming together, some of them driven by smartphones, like the sensors which are more widely available that allow us to be more aware of our physiological parameters, such as our blood sugar levels, our heart rate, and so forth. Part of it comes from all kinds of other things, but this convergence is bringing about what this author, who I actually recommend, Eric Topol, who's talked about the creative destruction of medicine, technology superconvergence, allowing an industry which badly needs improvement. There's a huge money going into this healthcare system, often very inefficiently, despite people individually working in it very hard. A lot of the time it's a very miserable outcome, and he is advocating, quite rightly I believe, that many of the technologies are just ripe to come in and transform our healthcare. Some of these technologies, you know, I want to highlight one in particular, synthetic biology. Synthetic biology is when we program not just silicon, as in traditional computers, it's when we can program life itself. It's when we program in carbon. And if you think about synthetic chemistry was when we learned about 150 years ago to increasingly create new kinds of chemicals And that made a big, big difference to what we could do, what we could manufacture, what we could wear. Synthetic biology is going to take things even further. So that is just about to come to the boil. And the largest example of convergence of all that I want to talk about, which has synthetic biology as one of its streams, is this NBIC, some of you may have heard of, the Nano Bio Info Cogno convergence, in which four very important areas of the technology are each accelerating and they're each improving because of the impact of each other. So nanotech is the ability to manipulate atoms on an individual level. Some of it we can see in things like 3D printing. Some of it we can see in more and more manipulation. We can put smaller and smaller sensors into the human body. We can even put smaller sensors into brains. And through this, we can understand more what's happening in the brain. We can understand about neurons. And the cognotech is a better understanding of the mind, a better understanding of what influences our moods, a better understanding of what influences our creativity, our intelligence. Once we understand the brain more, many of these insights can be applied into the field of ICT, and we can get better software that more closely takes advantage of insights of the brain, and we can also apply it to improvements in the genes. There are many interactions between there, and where is it all heading? As these technology streams impact each other and change each other, well, that's what sometimes people call the singularity. And I've drawn that there as a black hole, partly because it's unpredictable. It's very unclear how these technologies are actually going to impact each other, and partly because the word singularity borrows an idea from physics. You know, that there's a singularity inside the black hole, when all we can know is that our current understanding of physics breaks down. Or there's a singularity in mathematics when things go right off the chart. So a singularity is potentially within our grasp. I'm going to argue that the singularity might be here within 30 years, possibly even within 15 years, as these technologies interact and improve. Sometimes the singularity is called the omega point, to borrow a term from older philosophy. Sometimes it's not called omega, it's called the oh my God spot, when things happen. Sometimes called the spot where humans take on almost divine powers, where we become godlike, because of the capabilities we will have to create life and to create life, mind, and to do things which previously people would have said are just miraculous. The singularity is basically, as I said, we can no longer predict what's coming next. One thing is that the computers and robots that are in there are, because they have benefited from insight from our brains, they may become more intelligent than us, not just better at searching, not just better at navigating, they're better than us generally, including better at us than creating new robots and computers. And what's likely to happen is in a very short space of time, there will be a rapid recursive self-improvement cycle leading to vastly intelligent computers and robots, which are much smarter than we can currently conceive. And in some ways that's great, because we can get them to run a resource-based economy. Ideally, we can get them to deal with some of the terrible 3Ds, disease, death, and dysfunctional economics. We can get them to do all that. On the other hand, I said at the beginning, you know, we should by no means be complacent, because before we get there, there are all kinds of possible bad outcomes of the technologies that I've been speaking about, and there are bad outcomes in the way that we are overusing the planet. I think the next 15 to 30 years are going to be extremely critical indeed, and surviving these will be ultra critical. I do see a race. I see a race between, on the one hand, increasing complexity of society, rapidly diminishing resources, which we saw in the very first talk in the morning, and if we're not careful, this will lead to lots of wars, lots of terrorism, lots of conflicts, sometimes called the long emergency, sometimes called the negative singularity. I do think that is a real prospect. I'm not at all complacent that we've got this licked. On the other hand, if we can apply the technology for our greater intelligence, collectively and individually, to be more innovative, to actually figure out how to make the transitions that were spoken about earlier, to use more of the solar power wisely, to create this aquaponics farming and so forth, I believe it can be done. We will see this positive singularity. But as I've said, there's a real race, and it's not particularly clear how that's going to be won. I do think the key to winning this race is to change the mindset, to use your word, the zeitgeist, or to make it clear to people that it is actually right and good to embrace enhancing humanity and moving from humanity to humanity plus. And by humanity plus, I mean the vision that we are on this point of a momentous leap forward in evolution, not just in social structure, but of what we as individuals can experience and feel like. In some sense, the jump that this is going to enable us is intelligent evolution, intelligent design. In some ways, it will be as dramatic as the jump up from apes to humans in terms of the sophistication and the experiences that can be unleashed. If we're wise and strong, we can make that leap, and there are all kinds of positive side effects. But as I mentioned, technology is very much a two-edged sword. Alongside this potential to use technology in a very positive way, there are all kinds of risks of destruction. There's lots and lots of red text on that chart, which I don't intend to go through. I think you know the basic point. Continuing the status quo is not the option. There's no way that this race can be solved just by stopping the race. You know, there are too many things in movement. The only way to go forwards for the sustainability that we all in this room aspire to is to embrace the idea of radical enhancement, moving from humanity to humanity plus. So in the shorter term, what does it mean? Because I think that's about 15 to 30 years in the future, that change. We've got to survive there in the short term. What does it mean? I've already talked about some of it. We're going to see the smartphone technology changing so many parts of our environment. We're going to see the change to personal digital medicine. More and more of us have got drugs or treatments that are tailored to us as individuals, including synthetic organs, which will make us our bodies fit again. Increasingly, we'll also improve our minds through a whole combination of treatments, whether it's smart drugs, whether it's smart hearts that actually stimulate parts of the brain. And incidentally, that is the subject of the talk in a week's time at London Futurists. So if you're interested in getting a smarter brain, you might be interested in coming along to that. We're seeing early signs of the impact of nanotechnology in the transformation of manufacturing through 3D printers and 3D scanners, which I think is absolutely going to turn things upside down. We're seeing more and more intelligence throughout the environment, sometimes called the Internet of Things, sometimes just called general artificial intelligence. One example is driverless cars. When cars kill so many people all the time because of mistakes made by the human drivers, once we replace them by robots driving them, there'll be much less human death. On the other hand, there'll be many less people employed as drivers. And that takes us back to the point mentioned at the beginning that more and more of us are actually going to be displaced from the work environment over the next 5 to 10 years by robots and intelligence of one sort or another. More and more people, intelligent, hardworking, people who really desperately would like to work are not going to find that kind of work available, and we are going to face a real crisis in social justice. It's going to get worse. In part, we're seeing it with increasing unemployment. In part, we're seeing it with the decline in the median wage. So people are in work, but they're not actually being paid more than before, apart from the fortunate 1% or 5% who are doing very well, thankfully. But the vast majority of people are not being paid more, in part because more and more of the work can be done by automation. I don't think the political parties, as they are arranged today, are actually going to be able to solve this. They need a radical transformation. Otherwise, there's going to be big, widespread social discontent. So that was my quick run through the next 15 years. I think we've got to appreciate what technology is going to do to us. It is hard to predict the future. Anybody, whether it's in Moses or Muhammad or Marx or Kurzweil or whoever who claims that there's you can be sure what's in the future is underestimating the difficulties of all what's going to happen. But we can get involved making a difference. And if you wanted to find out more, then a couple of bits of reading, which you can look at afterwards. There's the Singularity one-on-one webcast, which I think is very interesting. There is the H+ magazine. There's a woman here who says, "Oh my God, I missed the Singularity." I don't think you'll miss it, but you might miss the significance of it just before it comes. So there's lots of interesting articles in the H+ magazine, or one of my favorites is transhumanity.net, where strange, brilliant ideas for the future intermingle and breed. If you're interested in old-fashioned reading, you've got various books here which cover from a variety of perspectives the impact of technology, transforming human individuals, transforming human society. Some of these take a technology point of view, some of them take a philosopher's point of view, some of them take a political point of view. And if you're interested in technological unemployment, this is my last slide, there is a range of very interesting books on this. The first is by a couple of MIT academics who are immersed in industry. The second is by a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who also sees the coming onset of mass technological unemployment. And the last is by Federico Pistono, who is actually giving a talk at Z Day in Los Angeles as we speak, or probably a few hours' time. So, and you can, of course, find out more online. And that is my call to action. Please get involved in helping to cultivate the future. If you are a dot on the chart that you saw at the very beginning, please play your part. Let's get involved, even though we don't all agree. I'm sure in some of the details, at least we don't all agree yet. We all can see part of the solution, and let's talk. Thank you very much.
So, I hope you all got something from that, guys. It was certainly another one of the extremely impressive talks on the day at Z-Day in London this year. So, next on the agenda for today's show is continuing to read from the book The First Civilization. We left off at page 44 of the book, so if you want to go online and find that PDF, then please do so. You can get to it through the movement's website, or just type in The First Civilization Jas Garcha into Google and you should find it through there. Question: why do you want to get rid of my country? Is sovereignty not important? Why should we get rid of countries and borders? Many of us have grown up feeling like our country is part of our identities, and that we would be lost if not for this important aspect of ourselves. However, let's really stop and think about this objectively for a moment. As we discussed in the last section, without the need for governments or laws, the need for any kind of border diminishes very quickly. There is simply no practical purpose in separating ourselves if essentially the whole of humanity is united under the common ideals of a single system. In addition, the concept of nationalism, patriotism, is ultimately the act of celebrating superficial differences based on ethnicity, ideology, and culture. Fundamentally speaking, how would me stating that I'm a proud Canadian be any different than a KKK member stating that he is a proud Caucasian? Nationalism, patriotism, jingoism, whatever you want to call it, is just a socially acceptable form of bigotry and prejudice. It teaches us to think that we are superior to another group because we live between these imaginary lines and they live between those imaginary lines. Nationalism serves the primary purpose of uniting us in our shared contempt for other nations and unfamiliar cultures. And of course, nationalism is a great way for our leaders to convince us to do things we would not otherwise do. I would imagine that this is why pride in one's country is so thoroughly shoved down our throats throughout our education and well into adulthood through the media. An excellent example of this phenomenon is in the following quote: "Naturally, the common people don't want war, but after all, it is the leaders of a country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag people along. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. This is easy. All you have to do is tell them that they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for a lack of patriotism for exposing the country to danger. It works the same in every country." Hermann Göring, Nazi Reich Marshal under Adolf Hitler. The love for this imaginary thing we call a country no longer serves any objective purpose other than dividing our species up based on superficial and imaginary differences, and giving manipulative leaders an easy way to play our emotions and brainwash us into hating the people they want us to hate. Unfortunately, strong emotional responses are easier to manipulate than logical ones. You might argue that since there would be essentially no reason to pursue war in an RBE, that this concern would no longer be applicable. However, the existence of separate nations means that there will always be reason for people to favour one group of humans over another. Phrases such as, "I must act in the best interests of my country," will always be an issue of contention and division, as long as we keep these imaginary borders around. Therefore, as long as countries exist, achieving anything close to world peace will be practically impossible. I should also take this time to mention the issue of sovereignty. Although the definition of sovereignty has continually changed throughout history, it generally refers to some level of independence in action. That is, a sovereign entity has the ability to choose its own course, free from outside interference. It could be argued that by isolating ourselves into nations, we achieve some level of sovereignty. Each nation is supposedly free to run itself without influence of outside nations and powers. However, this kind of sovereignty is largely an illusion. Any entity with enough economic or military power can impose its will on a sovereign country, thus shattering any semblance of sovereignty the defending nation might have. This could be seen in contemporary times with the way the IMF imposed its will on countries such as Greece, or with the recently ended American occupation of Iraq. The primary purpose national sovereignty serves at this point is to make it much easier for a government to get away with human rights abuses. As for the sovereignty of the individual, it is currently non-existent. We are all forced to abide by laws and a socio-economic structure that we may or may not agree with, and thus have no real sovereignty of our own. In an RBE, the focus would shift away from the now obsolete sovereignty of nations towards individual sovereignty. We would have total freedom from laws and the interference of any ruling body, where each human is allowed to have complete control over the pursuit of their own goals. Statement. This is the New World Order we've been warned about. You're trying to create a one-world government. The Internet is rife with rumours and evidence regarding an impending New World Order, NWO, or One World Government, OWG. The basic idea behind these assertions is that there are some powers in the world which are actively working towards unifying the planet under a single government or ruling body. In doing so, the entire world would be plunged into a single tyrannical dictatorship, where all of the world's people are oppressed by the same rulers. Could an RBE be this NWO? Am I trying to create an OWG by writing this book? Once again, I will argue that the truth is the very opposite of the assertion being made. An RBE would not be the creation of an OWG-NWO, but would actually be the dissolution of the one that essentially already exists. Let's stop and think about it for a moment. Every major economy in the world acts within the monetary market system, so the people who control the largest quantities of money have the most power and control over the lives of our species. A recent study in global corporate control shows that a large percentage of the entire global economic system is under the control of a single economic super entity, largely comprised of the most powerful financial institutions in the world. Control of 40% of the entire world's transnational corporations ultimately connects this core group of 147 companies, 75% of which are financial institutions. This core includes such names as Citigroup Inc., Goldman Sachs, the former Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, Bank of America Corporation, Credit Suisse, JP Morgan Chase & Co., and other financial powerhouses. You may recognize some of these names as being the groups responsible for the various economic collapses of the past few years, collapses which netted some of these groups huge amounts of profit. For all intents and purposes, an OWG is already here. It was essentially created as soon as some individuals became wealthy enough to exercise control over such a large part of the world's economy. However, this is not necessarily an indication of some kind of conspiracy in which shady men sit in a dark room and plot to control the world. All that is required for this level of global control to emerge is that each group follows good capitalist logic. Constantly seek to increase profit and consolidate power. As long as the most powerful entities always follow this one rule, this kind of system of global control will emerge naturally. In a competitive economic system, which by definition fosters self-interest above all else, it makes logical sense that some groups will eventually rise to a level of extreme wealth and power, thereby becoming de facto rulers of the world. After all, you need to spend money to make money, which means that those with the most money will always have a much easier time making more of it than those with no money. It's hard to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps when you can't afford the boots or the straps. Therefore, this kind of economic dictatorship is a mathematical inevitability that we have been approaching for centuries. While a group with great economic power is not a government in the traditional sense, it nonetheless has the same effect as one: the ability to exercise great power over the lives of a large number of people and large amounts of resources. So while we may not be dealing with a true one-world government, we are nonetheless dealing with something that is practically indistinguishable from one. As long as capitalism retains its control of our planet, this super entity will only become stronger and stronger, and therefore push us closer and closer to the creation of an actual new world order. Now, how would an RBE be different? After all, this would still be a single world united under common ideals. Isn't that the same as an NWO-OWG? Well, the most important difference between an RBE and an NWO-OWG is in the lack of governments or laws and the level of equality that is built into the system. It would certainly be one world, but there would be no government. It would also be a new world, but there would be no imposed order. And since this is a system of complete equality, there would be no way for one group to impose any kind of tyranny on the others. The most frightening aspect of an NWO-OWG is the dictatorial power that one group has over the rest of the planet. In an RBE, literally every aspect of society is under the control of the entire population. By having society work in an open-sourced fashion like this, it would be impossible for one group to take over society and impose their will on the rest. The rest of the population could simply override the controlling group through the processes built directly into the system. In fact, this system is literally designed to be as resistant to absolute minority control as possible. This is another thing that makes an RBE so different from the familiar economic systems of the last few centuries. An RBE is built to prevent the accumulation of power in the hands of a small group, whereas traditional economic systems are built to encourage it. Not surprisingly, that is precisely the situation we find ourselves in now. We are desperately in need of a new world, and we will never achieve lasting peace unless we can make up and realize that we are one world. It's any imposed order and government that we need to be wary of. Statement. This sounds a lot like utopianism. Creating a utopia is impossible, stupid. A utopia is a theoretical civilization that is absolutely perfect. It would be a society in which there are no problems to be solved and nothing ever needs to change because everything is the best it can possibly be. Would an RBE be a utopian civilization? Absolutely not. Admittedly, it might have some superficial similarities to utopianism in that it would be an attempt to create a society that functions as well as possible. However, there is a huge difference between something that works as well as possible and something working perfectly. Perfection implies no problems or negative situations of any kind, whereas an RBE is simply an attempt to minimize problems and negative situations. These situations will still likely exist, and as society advances, new problems will almost certainly pop up in place of the ones that we solve. The purpose of an RBE is to try to make sure that there will be as few problems as possible, but to eliminate them entirely is not realistic. Perhaps the biggest difference between a utopia and an RBE would be the lack of stagnation. A utopia would be a completely stagnant society in which nothing would ever change or improve, since everything is already perfect. However, an RBE is a system that actively seeks to identify and improve upon its own shortcomings and is therefore perpetually changing. The goal of a utopia is to achieve a certain state that is perfect, whereas the goal of an RBE is to constantly improve, which requires constant changes in state. An ever-changing society is literally the polar opposite of a utopian society, since change immediately implies that a state of perfection has not yet been attained. Practically speaking, there is simply no way to achieve a state of perfection for two reasons. 1. The word perfect is largely subjective. One person's definition of perfection may not be the same as another person's definition. This immediately raises the question of who decides what perfect is. If society is attempting to achieve a state of perfection, whose definition will we use to describe our goal? Right away we can see that this kind of society is the perfect setup for a dictatorship, where one group's definition of perfect dictates the structure of society to the rest of the population. 2. As long as our knowledge continues to change and evolve, so too would our definition of perfect. For example, let's say we create a society that is as technologically advanced as possible in every aspect. If someone comes up with a way to make computers 0.1% faster, then our entire civilization immediately becomes technically obsolete. It can no longer be considered perfect. The simple truth is that we live in a world which is always changing. Therefore, a society that never changes cannot exist. A utopia is simply a mathematical impossibility, like counting to the number infinite. So the point of an RBE is not to achieve a certain state and then remain there for all eternity. Rather, the point is to create a society that embraces constant change and never exists in the same state for longer than what is practical. This kind of society is decidedly non-utopian, and it is actually much better described as an extropian society. Extropianism refers to a set of ideas in which there are no particular beliefs or policies which are touted as absolute truths. The point of extropian society is simply to use rational thinking and practicality to continually improve human life and reduce human suffering. Once again, this is a society in which there is no specific definition of perfection and no illusions of attaining this false ideal. It encourages constant change for the better, while acknowledging that change will always be necessary. This is the truest description of an RBE that I could possibly give. So, is an RBE a utopian society? No. It is the complete opposite, in that it is a society which recognizes the need for constant change, something which goes against the very foundation of a utopia. Question. This whole thing sounds a lot like a cult. Are you trying to convert me to something? This is one of the most interesting assertions regarding the RBE idea that I've ever heard. Is this a cult? Are the people who support the concept of an RBE just a bunch of brainwashed cultists? Well, a cult is generally an organization, usually with some kind of religious overtone, that seeks to force people into adopting a certain set of ideas or practices that society at large deems abnormal, and almost always restricts members' ability to seek outside information. The concept of an RBE is built on the principles of science and logic. A set of ideas based on science is by definition always changing. There are no accepted truths or ideologies to cling to, and nothing which is considered sacred. Like the claims of utopianism, the truth regarding an RBE is that it is literally the opposite of a cult. A cult implies a fixed worldview where certain ideas are deemed right and true. This is exactly the opposite of what the RBE concept is trying to achieve. The entire purpose of the RBE is to establish a society which is constantly improving and changing. The concept of an ever-changing set of ideas forming the basis of a cult makes very little sense. One might still argue that this is a cult in that it encourages the spreading of abnormal ideas. However, if that is the case, then literally every person who is attempting to change the world in any way is some kind of cultist. What we consider abnormal is a continually changing definition that varies greatly depending on location and time. For example, it was once considered normal for people to move from continent to continent on ships. If we are going to refer to anything abnormal as a cult, then the Wright brothers would have to be considered cultists for inventing the airplane. Obviously, this is yet another logical fallacy. The definition of abnormal is simply too variable to be a logical basis for judging what is and is not a cult. Lastly, there is the all-important notion that a cult must attempt to brainwash people into believing that certain things are absolute truths. This is generally done in two ways. Force people to only consider one set of information as being right and discourage anyone from seeking outside information. If this were a cult, then I would want to prevent you from seeking outside knowledge and force you to rely strictly on the teachings that I am peddling. The last thing I would want is for you to discover things for yourself, or to question the things that are in this book. Therefore, it would make absolutely no sense for me to make the following statement. Please go out and do your own independent research. Don't just blindly accept the things I'm saying in this book. Instead, question every word that I have written here. Make sure that I am providing you with solid evidence and sound logic before you accept any of the claims I have made. If the evidence is really as strongly in favour of an RBE as I say it is, then anyone should be able to come to the same conclusions that I did through their own independent research and rational thought. I wrote this book by thinking for myself, and I strongly encourage you to do the same. If this really were a cult, clearly it would not be a very robust one. No cult can survive by encouraging potential converts to seek outside information and think for themselves. I must stress that I am not trying to push certain ideas as being right or true. I'm simply providing you with information and applying my own logical analysis to it, and I encourage you to employ your own logic in determining whether or not anything I've said here makes any sense. I'm not trying to force you into accepting certain ideas or truths. If anything, I'm hoping that reading this book will make you ask more questions and become more skeptical of the world around you. The supporters of an RBE are not a cult. We are simply people who have looked at the world rationally and have come to a common conclusion. That is all an RBE is, a rational solution to the problems produced by modern society. Statement. You're trying to destroy my way of life. Of all the assertions I've discussed in this chapter, this one has the most truth to it. An RBE is in fact an attempt to change the way the majority of us live. I must stress once again that it would only be the majority and not the whole population, as an RBE is a voluntary society. Since it accepts the formation of small, low-tech communities, it would not be necessary for literally every person to alter their lifestyle. Otherwise, this is, for the most part, a suggestion to change your way of life. Note that I said suggestion to change rather than force you to change. The question to ask is this: is our current way of life actually worth keeping? Let's think about it for a moment. Our current way of life brings suffering, war, poverty, hunger, social stratification, violence and stress to essentially the entire world. Even someone who is succeeding in our current system will often have to spend much of their time performing socially pointless tasks they'd rather not do, while contributing to environmental destruction and slave labour in developing nations. The new way of life that an RBE advocates would bring sustainability, global prosperity, health and freedom, where every person is able to pursue fulfilling tasks without worry. Is our current way of life worth keeping in the face of this new way? Are we so afraid of change that we'd rather go on suffering under an oppressive system than even thinking about trying something else? As usual, there is no right answer to this question. It is up to every individual human to decide for themselves which way of life is more desirable. Pointless toil, environmental destruction and human suffering versus relative freedom, environmental balance and human prosperity. It may seem that I'm intentionally making a biased comparison here, but I honestly can't see how this comparison could be made any more objective. Question: what if I enjoy performing labour tasks? Not everyone hates working with their hands. If you enjoy performing labour tasks, then perform them. You could do this either by joining one of the non-mainstream communities where labour tasks might still be rewarded for some form of currency, or you could just do them for fun in an RBE. Let's not forget that one of the purposes of this new system is to allow people to freely pursue activities they find enjoyable. If you enjoy building things with your hands, for example, there would be nothing to stop you from doing so. We should also remember that many of these kind of tasks require an artisan-like skill, and these are skills which are important to keep alive in our society. No matter how well prepared we are for disaster scenarios, there is always the chance that for some reason we might suddenly find our technology useless or destroyed. Solar flares come to mind. And thus the ability to craft things manually is not a skill that we would want to lose. It would be very wise for us to include lessons on such things in the general knowledge database, so that they would always be available to curious humans. Our species evolved as a tool-making animal, and so most of us have a desire to create things with our hands. This is a desire which will likely always exist, so I have no fear that the ability to create things manually will ever be lost to our species. So if you enjoy making things with your hands, I would strongly encourage you to continue doing so in an RBE. It's a valuable skill that our society would be poorer for losing. Question: what if the technology breaks? Who would fix it? Isn't this a disaster scenario? What would we do if the computers started to malfunction? Would this spell the end of our new society? How could we convince someone to fix them without money or without the fear of that group trying to take over our computer network? If there is one thing that modern computing has taught all of us, it's that computers malfunction. Granted, the computers being used in an RBE would be the highest quality computers that could possibly be created, but there is still always the chance that there could be some kind of breakdown. Fortunately, an RBE is innately set up to prevent the disaster that might stem from such a situation. All of the global databases would be distributed throughout the world's computers without being connected on a single system, much like the Internet of today. This is why the entire Internet doesn't go down when a single computer or website goes down. The network is distributed across an entire planet's worth of systems. Therefore, the odds of the entire global network crashing are very small. But what if things do go awry? This is why education is one of the utmost importance in an RBE. We need to ensure that humans as a whole will possess the knowledge necessary to deal with any computer problems that surface. Luckily for us, this is a society in which education on every subject is freely available to everyone. The odds that there will not be any humans who are knowledgeable enough to fix the problem is extremely low. This same logic would not only apply to the field of computing, but to all fields of human knowledge. Even if the computers are doing all of the background thinking for us, we as a species must retain the basic knowledge necessary to do that very same background thinking. Therefore, in the same way that we make modern engineers learn complex math, even though many of them will never actually use it in their careers, we must also ensure that our education system is set up so that individuals must be able to display adequate knowledge of the background material in each subject. This could easily be done by making use of the question and problem-solving modules which are programmed into the global knowledge database. The key to ensuring the integrity of an RBE lies in education. It is also through education that we would ensure that no group would be able to take over society by taking advantage of computer malfunctions. With education so widespread and easily available, there will always be another group that possesses the knowledge necessary to counter any acts of shady computing. There is also the simple question of why. Why would anyone want to purposely bring down a society that is specifically built to take care of them and make their lives as fulfilling as possible? The odds that someone living in an RBE would want to cause its destruction are extremely low, since there would be nothing to gain from this act and everything to lose. Remember, in an RBE, we would not force people to act a certain way. Instead, society is specifically set up so that there is no reason anyone would want to engage in any destructive acts. As I've repeatedly stated, humans do not engage in violence and destruction for no reason. Without any reason for a person to want to harm society, there is extremely little chance that anyone would do so. To summarize, If computers begin to break, we have a distributed computing network that would minimize the spreading of damage and a highly educated population with the motivation to fix it. After all, this society actually takes care of them. And we'll stop reading there for today. The next statement to be addressed is, but I don't want computers to control my life. And I won't go on about that particular topic now because I'll save it for Jas Garcha's excellent answer to it in the next section of the book. I would like to add one thing about control and people taking over the system that's also important to explicitly mention, and that is that this is another reason for why a resource-based economy can only work without money. Money means the access to more control over more resources and labour, and therefore access to purchasing power to buy life-sustaining resources than someone else, and therefore more right to exercise dominance over someone else and more control. If you don't have a system where someone can actually exert that sort of dominance over you, then you don't have a system where someone would have access to be able to even perpetrate such an act of terrorism, I suppose you could call it, or whatever, where they want to bring down the entire global system. And hang on a second, even if they did, you're telling me they're going to walk into the technical team who oversee the functional operation of the computer systems globally, which, as mentioned, are actually interconnected like the internet, so I can't see how you're going to actually take the whole system down anyway. But just for argument's sake, if you could, you're telling me they're going to walk into a technical team of people who are living in a resource-based economy where all of their needs are being met, and they're in that technical team with the interest of bettering the whole of humanity, and you're going to walk in there and say, hey, how about we go back to having nuclear weapons, drop this system, and give me the big red button? And you're thinking they're going to turn around and say, yeah, why not? Good idea. Really? In a system where there's no money, so that this person does not have control. He does not have the right to order them around, and they know it. And that's the system you fear. Really? It's rather ironic that people put up this kind of protest, which comes from a decent place, you know. They don't want people having that sort of tyrannical control over their lives. That's obviously understandable. But what do you think you have now? They can't see that the system they have now has that tyrannical control over their lives. The whole point of this system is to rid ourselves of needing to feel that we should order each other around, rather than actually just order our environment so that we don't have to order people around. That's the point, and do it technically, do it scientifically. The more funny of the arguments I've had regarding technology are the people who are the technophobes, who are like, I don't know, I don't like all this technology, and yet you're arguing with me about that point on the internet via your laptop. Okay. So, anyway, I guess there's not that much point in getting too frustrated about this, folks. It's going to be a long old haul from here on in. And it's been a long old haul today on this radio show. Thank you very much for listening to me today. I know it's been a long, sort of rambling one, but I hope you've enjoyed it. But before I call it a day today, just a couple of other things. June the 4th at the Elixir Bar in Camden is our next town hall event over here in London. This particular event is going to be a dual presentation between the movement and a friend of mine, John Webster, who is making a documentary called Strawman, Nature of the Cage, which is about legal fiction and what the law really means and how we can potentially resist unjust law. So that should be a really interesting event, so please do come along to that. It kicks off at about 7 o'clock in the evening, so it'll be good to see you there. And also, apologies for my last radio address going out. I believe it was only 12 minutes long when it came out a little bit late. There was some technical issues with regards to Ben McLeish not being able to get into a hotel room on time to actually get his internet connection sorted out because there was a problem with the key. Just one of the many lovely attributes of the inefficiencies of our system. keys that don't work, for doors that don't need to be locked, to protect stuff that we more than likely wouldn't need if we actually learn to share it all efficiently. But I won't go off on that tangent this late in the show. But the main thing is that it's all done now. It's up online and ready for you to download and have a listen to. So I'm going to close today with a song from the band I used to be in, Shell Shock. This particular track is called The Maze, and I think if you listen to the lyrics, you'll understand what it's going on about. Okay, so enjoy, guys. See you soon.